interested.
Sorry, I'm just going to record Christina's. I forgot to switch it on, so I'm going to just record Christina's talk.
So I always had a slightly spiritual tendency. I think you can tell that from my childhood reading. I loved The Secret Garden and Heidi. I was and I was enthralled by the story of St. Francis when we learnt it at school when I was about 8. So there was something going on in the background. But nonetheless, I loved nature study. I studied biology. I went to university. I read natural sciences. I thought biology was going to be able to explain how life works, and to some extent, indeed, it does. I became a biology teacher. I was absolutely in the scientific mode, but I also had an artistic side that needed expression. So when my children went to school, I decided to become a garden designer, because that could use my botany, and I would be able to develop an artistic side. No thoughts of spirituality at all at this point. I was just being very practical. I was going to make beautiful gardens for my clients, and that was that. Garden design was about assessing the site, getting the brief from the client, designing something that worked, that the builders could build, and making a beautiful garden. There was a lot about aesthetics, and very, very little, if anything at all, about how a garden makes a person feel. It was all about looking at it and seeing something that looked good, according to the designer and the client. And it was often about the designer expressing themselves in the garden, rather than the garden being the most important thing. It was about the designer. And designers like to have their gardens recognized as being designed by them, because then they get more work. If someone goes to a garden and it's lovely and it's designed by Christina Fitzsimmons, they'll get Christina Fitzsimmons to design another garden. So it can feed into a lot of egotism as well. And there's also the need for quick results, because you need to get good photographs for your portfolio to get more work. So the whole commercial side of it tends to impinge a bit on the artistic and aesthetic side, and any other thoughts you might have about it. So I designed gardens for private clients for 25 years. And over that time, I increasingly noticed that some of my clients would come to me and say, "Oh, Christina, this garden has changed my life. You've changed my life. This is wonderful. I feel quite differently about it." And very often these were rather wealthy, very high-powered, jet-setting, often men who were charging around the world, being incredibly important, had no thought of feelings about a garden. This was not something that they could engage with. And yet suddenly they would find that they would be emotionally moved by being in their garden, and they loved it and they felt different. This happened to me several times. And I began to think, something more going on here than I had really realized. What is it that I'm doing to make these gardens so special? And I thought, well, I could improve my practice and get more work if I work out exactly what it is that I'm doing in these gardens that makes them have this effect. You know, if I can sort of tabulate it and get it all organized, I can do it on purpose rather than by chance, which was what seemed to be going on. So I started investigating. I had noticed that there are certain places in the landscape where you stop automatically when you're on a walk. You just stop. It's a place where you rest. I was thinking about that, and what is it about those places? So that was one avenue of investigation. I also, at that point, I discovered the quiet garden movement. This was obviously an organisation that was appealing to something about gardens that was different from what I'd been working with. And I spent one summer visiting about a dozen different quiet gardens. I visited the gardens. I just worked on looking at how they affected me, and then analysing in my head why a particular part of the garden was affecting me the way it did. I talked to visitors to quiet gardens. I talked to their hosts. I found out what people were feeling and how this was all working. And this was all very, very interesting stuff. And equally, as this was going on, I also got interested in Japanese gardens and Zen gardens. And I was lucky enough to be able to visit Kyoto twice in a group that was led by a man called Robert Ketchell, who is absolutely steeped in Japanese gardens. He's an Englishman, but he's worked for several years in Japanese gardens, and he knew all about it. And we looked at tea gardens, and the Japanese are very deliberate in the way they design their gardens so that the garden actually has an effect on a person and changes their mood. The way they design a tea garden is to enable the visitor who arrives in the garden to make a journey across the garden. And by the end of the journey, they have shed any thoughts of the outside world. They have slowed down, they've tuned in, and they're ready to do the tea ceremony, which is a meditation on all of life. And the garden plays a very important part of that. So, and the Japanese are very organized. So they've got it all written down and sorted out, and they tell you exactly how to do which bit so that it has the effect. So I thought this was really, really useful knowledge, which I brought back to the UK. So I was finding out what happens to people in gardens, how you can organize gardens to make that happen. And then I had a personal revelation. Back in 2013, I underwent some fairly major surgery. And as you can imagine, in the days leading up to it, I was pretty frightened. And I spent a lot of time in my own garden. We have a swing seat in an area where there's long grass and a pond, and it's very peaceful. And I sat on this swing seat for hours and hours, dealing with my fears, as I hoped. And at one point, I was watching the bees in the flowers, just moving from one flower to another. And there was some bird song, and there was a spider doing something, making a web somewhere. And life was just carrying on in my garden. And I realized that this was something that was here now, and it was going to continue while I was away having my surgery. And whatever happened to me, it would still be there if I came back or I didn't come back, and it would be there to welcome me when I did come back. Or if I didn't, then it would still be there. And actually, I was also part of it. It just came as a kind of huge wave of feeling that was really quite a revelation. So all of these things came together, and then later on, I met Patrick and another lady called Angie, a garden designer, and we designed the garden for the flower show at Malvern that happened in 2014. And I was able to use all the thoughts and all the information, all the things I'd learnt through this period of study about how to make a garden a quiet, contemplative, peaceful, healing place. And the challenge, of course, was to do that within the context of a busy showground. You know, it wasn't just a quiet corner, it was a very busy place. So we did that, we built it together. Patrick provided plants and expertise, horticultural expertise, and I was thinking more about the shape of the garden and the design and the feelings it would evoke. And lo and behold, people sort of came to it from across the showground. They seemed to be drawn to it. They arrived, they stopped, and they fell silent. And they looked, and they just were, and things happened to them. And people who were in the garden, surrounded, like being in a goldfish bowl, surrounded by people looking in, the people in the garden were able to concentrate on what was going on inside the garden and seemed oblivious to the people watching them. So that felt very, very successful. And we were very pleased, weren't we, Patrick? Because we won the People's Choice Award for that garden. And we're now thinking about it, we're very pleased because we think it was one of the very first gardens of that kind at a flower show. And now, you know, anyone who's been watching Chelsea recently or any of the other flower shows, every other garden is about well-being and feeling good and health, mental and physical health. So we felt pleased about that. Now, since Malvern, I've no idea how I'm doing for time, Ian.
Yeah, we need to
wrap up. Well, anyway, since Malvern, I've been just continuing with the theme, really. I did a course with William Bloom to become a spiritual companion, because actually by this time I'd realized this was not just me being a garden designer, this was me looking for something much deeper. So I've been on this more spiritual quest since then. So I did the course with William to become a spiritual companion. And I decided that my own garden is my spiritual companion and spiritual companion to the people who visit it. And that's what I do. I open my garden every other week during the summer for people to come and be and experience whatever they can and in the garden. And I continue to read and study Buddhism and Celtic Christianity, and just everything feeds into this whole theme, which is about being in the garden and our connection with nature. So
that's great. Thank you,
yeah.
Christina. It's beautiful. Thank
That's
you so
it.
much. And I've got some photographs of that garden that Christina sent me, the one that she and Patrick designed. I'll put them on Zoom. I'll try and put them on Zoom anyway across the lunch hour, so that I'll put them on the share facility so that you can see them at lunchtime, if I can make that work. Okay. So next, I'd like to introduce Patrick. Patrick's been head gardener at Holland House for quite a number of years now. Not full time. He has a very full-time life in other areas of his work. At the moment, he's working as a consultant, has done for several years, for all the huge swathes of the National Trust's gardens. But I managed to hang on to him, and he's done wonders for the Holland House garden over the years, completely transformed it. So I'm delighted to introduce Patrick, and really the same question for you, Patrick. Horticulturally trained, very knowledgeable about plants and gardens, but somehow this has kind of morphed into something more deep than that.
Hello, thank you, Ian, and hello, everyone. Lovely to see you, if only in little tiles along the top of my screen. I'll just apologise. I've got a little bit of a tickly cough, so I might cough and splutter every now and again, but we'll live with that. So yeah, I think never has there been a more timely moment to have this sort of gathering, looking at the spirituality of gardens, the wider meaning of gardens. Is there more to a garden than just a grouping of botanical collections in a nice space? Actually, is there more to it than that? And actually, yeah, there is so much more to it than that, that Christina and I and Ian and several others are really now getting to grips with, and as is actually the much wider world. So how do I come into all of this? Well, gardens just run right the way through me, and always have done since I can ever remember. I mean, how I describe it is actually, if you cut me open, gardens would just leak out of me from every direction. They just run right through me, right from some of my very earliest memories of actually sowing seeds in the garden at home, aged about 4 or 5. my absolute fascination with my granddad's garden. Imagine a typical 1930s semi-detached, those really long, narrow gardens that they had. I just loved going to granddad's garden. It was just absolutely immaculate, typical sort of, imagine of that period, sort of 1950s, 60s gardens. They were absolutely immaculate, and the hybrid tea roses, and then through the archway to the rows and rows of just gorgeous, luscious vegetables growing beyond there. And I was in my heaven there in Grandad's garden. And this interest grew me. We moved to Worcestershire, and I was always the gardener at home, encouraged by my parents, who my mother particularly was keen, but had a different profession entirely. But I was slightly encouraged, but it was an interest that I picked up myself and ran with. Even ended up doing little gardening jobs around the village for pocket money when I was at school, eventually realizing I wanted this to be my career. So I actually went and studied horticulture professionally at Writtle Agricultural College at Chelmsford, did a 3-year horticultural horticultural course there, and then set out with just wanting to have a career in horticulture. And after brief dalliance with garden design, actually ended up going down the route of heritage gardens, being head gardener of just the wonderful, gorgeous, historic gardens that we have in this country. Gardens all over the place. Walsingham Abbey in Norfolk, I was head gardener there, and for a good number of years I was head gardener at Arley Hall in Cheshire, with those famous huge double herbaceous borders that they have there. And that was a wonderful time, and I've honed my skills as what I would call a real nerd, for want of a better word, in heritage gardening. So what are the old tricks and the old tricks and methods that the Victorian head gardeners used to use? Whether you can remember or watched this series that was on, again, this was about 30 years ago, The Victorian Kitchen Garden with Peter Thoday and Harry Dodson. That came just as I started college, and that was rekindle heaven. That was like honey to a bee to me. That was fantastic. And it was honing those sort of horticultural skills, and how could I rekindle those skills, and running a garden team in a 25-acre heritage garden, and demonstrate and rekindle those heritage skills, but actually using them in a more sort of modern 21st century way that would fit with the smallest sort of staffing numbers at a modern heritage garden. So I was absolutely in my element there, loving every second of it. And then 12, 15 years ago, moved back down to my home area of Worcestershire, where I set up more as a sort of independent consultant, if you like, consultant head gardener in that sort of thing. But and that continued, and I've had private clients, and have, as Ian has said, I spend quite a bit of my time now working for the National Trust. I'm consultant particularly to all their gardens in Wales, so it's the likes of Bodnant, Powys Castle, Dyffryn, all those absolutely gorgeous places, which again is absolutely lovely for me. I get paid to go to National Trust gardens, so it's wound up rather well in that respect. But yeah, so horticulturally fantastic, but actually quite some way back through that story, I started to realize, well, there's something else going on here as well, very similar to Christina, but mine was where Christina noticed it from her clients, from being a garden designer. I was noticing just by being in and working with a garden, having my fingers in the soil, walking out, being the first one, opening the gates of the gardens at Arley Hall at sort of 8 o'clock on a misty morning, no one else there, and getting there and turning the key in the big iron gates of the walled garden and squeaking it open and walking in. And that was just the most magical moment and magical place to be in this garden, just this wonderful, beautiful, almost blessed place. I thought, yeah, okay, I've got this connection with it as a professional, but you know what, there's something more going on here. Now, alongside all of that, through most of my life, I've had a fairly sort of spiritual, faithful life. I've followed the Christian faith. Like all of us, it sort of goes up and down, but it's generally always there. So I've had a sort of spiritual awareness. And there is more to life than just facts and figures and nuts and bolts and science, as wonderful as all that is. There's another dimension to all of this. And I started to actually realize this connection. Actually, I'm feeling happy and feeling better when I'm in the garden or as I often do, pull my boots and go walking across the hills through nature and in the countryside. And I realized actually, yeah, there is this connection here. So I started to read into that a little bit more. Started to read all sorts of books from all sorts of people. One of my favorites actually, someone who, and people have known about this for centuries. A few people have known about this for centuries, but it's actually only just now bubbling to the surface. And one of the greatest people who understood this connection with nature and spirituality was the 17th century priest and philosopher Thomas Trahearne, who wrote, "When I came into the countryside and being seated among the trees and had all mine time in my own hands, I resolved to spend it all, whatever it cost me, in search of happiness in that place." And he sort of hit the nail on the head back in about 16 something or other, that a lot of us are only just now realizing now. And so I studied further, and like a lot of us, I was on furlough last year for a lot of time, and actually had something of a sabbatical studying gardens. Actually studied Japanese gardens, and as Christina has said, it's exactly that. You start to realize that a lot of faiths around the world have actually understood this for thousands of years. And you look exactly as Christina's described, the way the Japanese honor nature and realize nature does them good. So they build these garden spaces so they can have this honoring of nature on a domestic scale outside their back door, and designed in such a way that they can connect and walk through and be in that garden space, a way that maximizes the benefit of that experience. So you quickly start to realize then there's this connection. There's the horticulture stuff, the plant science, the garden design, the lovely Edwardian herbaceous borders, the walled gardens, vineries, all that sort of lovely stuff that you see when you walk into a National Trust garden that I'm utterly soaked in. But there's also this other side, the spiritual side, and there is a definite connection I've noticed between them, and that is now starting to be picked up and realized. It's not just the ancient, the Japanese gardeners, and actually the Islamic gardens from sort of 2,000-3,000 years ago, they Far Eastern gardens, they were of the same understanding. But actually now, eventually, lo and behold, the West is waking up to this now. Always, we like to think we're trailblazers, but actually we often follow on behind. And so even now, to get the likes of the World Horticulture Society are starting to realize that actually, yes, there is more to gardens than just, it's moving away from just the how we garden to why do we garden. And it's asking ourselves that question. Okay, we can do all the mechanics of the how we garden, which is me when I'm wearing my gardens consultant's hat at Paris Castle, but actually step from that, okay, but why do we garden? Why do we, as mankind, as human beings, have this connection with something much deeper when we are in a garden space? And so that's sort of what we're trying to sort of unpick and unravel and talk about in this course over the next few hours.
So could you tell us a little bit about the science then, Patrick? Because I know you've done a lot of work on this, and you can only really, in the next sort of 15 minutes, I really only touch on the huge amounts of work you've done. But you've done a lot of work on and reading around. So yeah, why do we garden? I mean, why do humans so yearn for and desire, and as Thomas Trahearne said, when they're there, feel happy in green spaces?
Yeah, okay, well, there's an awful lot of science, as Christina and I have each found out in our readings into the back of this. Some of it which is what people just felt and what people just knew from actually tens of thousands of years ago, and what now modern 21st century science is actually proving in a totally empirical, there is empirical science now to prove what we are talking about here today. So as you all know, just about anyone will say, they feel better just by being outside in the green space. Or if you're not able to get outside, even just having a view of a tree out the window or a nice house plant on the shelf. I mean, and that that really bubbled to the surface, didn't it, through all the lockdown period last year. And so many people just said they just wanted to get out into the gardens or into the town park. And that's where they felt just the burden of everything that we were all as a nation going through last year. People's let off for that was actually to go into a green space, wasn't it? And that's what they wanted. And apparently I now read that apparently houses with large gardens, the values of those are now going through the roof, because everyone now all of a sudden, now lo and behold, wants a house with a large garden rather than these little modern postage stamp things. So yeah, people are starting to realize that. But why is this? Well, let's take ourselves back, and I don't mean take ourselves back to last year, through tens, in fact, hundreds of thousands of years, because we've evolved as a species, a human species. I mean, you can go right back when we crawled as a lizard out of the sea or whatever it was. Christina knows far more about that sort of side of things than me. But we have spent all our time as a species, nearly all our time, in close proximity to nature. Just like as we look out the window and see the birds and everything outside on our front lawn, or the wild animals out there who spend their whole existence outside in and living off nature. Us as human beings, we are actually the same. And us being removed from that existence in nature has only just been a tiny fragment of our existence as a species. If you can imagine, sort of from the Industrial Revolution onwards, there's an environmental scientist, Jules Parry, has calculated that we're actually human existence, you can calculate it as being about 350,000 generations. And in that 350,000 generations, we've largely lived with this closest to nature. And in evolutionary times, have only literally just switched over to urban living. He said, to sort of illustrate this, if you were to compact all of human existence into 1 week, starting on Monday morning, we have lived all that time as a species living in and with nature, right up until 3 seconds to midnight on the following Sunday evening. And that's when we then become an urban species. So we've had the whole week up until 3 seconds before midnight on Sunday as a species living in nature, and then we turn to an urban species. So is it any wonder that we naturally feel that nature is our place to be? So that, you know, the human brain has evolved in this context of the natural world, and that's perhaps explains why we have this mismatch when we don't find ourselves in the natural and green world. And so we evolved as first evolved thousands of years ago as hunter-gatherers, and this survival instinct obviously was in us as an animal species. And so we developed this basic understanding of plant life cycles, of how plants work. This is way back in sort of ancient history. And this collective memory built up in us as a species to know and understand that, yes, green nature is a good place. We can survive there. We can live there. And that's when the first scratchings of gardening and agriculture would have begun. And so geographer J. Appleton then developed a theory, what he called the psychology of landscape. And he said, with this innate need, understanding we have to see a green space, an open grassland space as a good place, that became embedded in our brains. So he said we could see this as what he called prospect, the view of a green, homely, comfortable place, prospect. But he says actually, also alongside that was a need for protection, what he called refuge. So you can imagine taking that safe green space, fencing it, hedging it, protecting it, whatever, to protect it and ourselves from danger. So you get this idea of prospect and refuge, a green space fenced or hedged or protected off. Well, isn't that actually the basic elements of what a garden is? And that, he says, is become, through our evolutionary journey as a human species, that is still now hardwired into our brain to recognize a protected green space as our home, as our comfortable space. That is still hardwired into our brains today. Now, because, again, part of our animal instinct, we are continually assessing the space we are in for danger. You know, we do it. I mean, imagine you're driving a car and driving along and someone pulls out the side where you would stop, wouldn't you? And that's all part of that natural animal instinct. And so, so we are constantly doing this as a species, but imagine we're doing that, scanning our eyes, our ears, our senses around us for comfort or danger all the time, against the background of our brain recognizing that a green safe space is our comfortable space. So if we err away from that, measure to a concrete urban space, that's going to start getting the danger lights flashing in our brains, isn't it? And so this has led to scientists realizing how, you know, you see this demonstration of people's behaviors. You know, many of us have probably been on the tube in London and it's busy and anxiety, you feel your anxiety levels going up and it's crowded and people start to become less aware of others around them, less caring perhaps of others around them. Yes, we all hear odd stories, a bit of care going on, but, you know, people shut down, become very insular, and that is because our brains are shutting down to our emergency condition. Our brains have developed over millennia from the core basic instinct animal to develop the more cognitive functions on the outside of the brain. But when we're faced with danger, imagine a lion is chasing you, you're not going to stop there and start to think, oh no, what should I do about this? You're going to immediately shut down those cognitive aspects of your brain and go straight to right survival run. Now you can imagine you're in an urban area. Okay, we're not being chased by a lion, but an element of that is starting to kick in. So our cognitive ability starts to reduce, our ability to relate to others around us starts to reduce, our ability to connect with perhaps nature or what is going on with us, if there is any, starts to reduce. And our subconsciously, our bodies are going into animal instinct survival mode when we are in that urban area. So we can understand how this really can have a huge effect on people's lives when they are removed from nature. And this has been proven, actually slightly taken it into a slightly extreme way, with scientists who study people who suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome, because their minds switch to this emergency scenario when there isn't an emergency situation present, and that is sort of really the definition of PTSD. And so they studied, well, actually, how do you heal someone who is in that place? And so scientists have discovered the starting point of that, you have got to put that person in a comfortable environment. You cannot work with that person if their mind is not in a comfortable, if they are not sensing they're in a comfortable place. And all the science has proven that actually the best way to do that is to place that PTSD sufferer in a garden environment. If you go back to what I was saying 5 minutes ago, that is our comfortable, safe space. So at that point, you put that sufferer in that quiet garden environment, and the brain starts to calm down, it starts to cool down, it starts to relax. The cognitive abilities in the brain start to lighten up and turn on again. You've moved away from your animal instinct emergency condition in the brain to your, I can relax, I can think, the cognitive functions are going, and at that point then the deeper healing and deeper mental and physical repair of those sufferers can take place. So that just gives us a very sort of basic idea of how we as a species, I think, are intrinsically linked to the green natural outdoors. That is still hardwired into our brains. And so I think from that, you can see how it's no accident that practitioners of all sorts of faiths and now medical practitioners are starting to recognise and use gardens as the place to take people to heal them. So I think now Christina can perhaps expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, thank you very much for Patrick. That's really great. Thank you so much. And I think that does lead on to Christina now telling us a little bit more about some of the science behind her work with gardens and her experience of gardens. So thank you, Christina. You'll need to unmute.
Sorry. Thank you, Patrick. You've really described the theory behind our love of green spaces, the evolutionary theory. There was a biologist called E.O. Wilson who described a phenomenon which he said is called biophilia, love of nature. And we have learned to love the things which have helped us to survive. I think humans have always known this thing that we love places which help us to survive. We've intrinsically just known it, been part of it, worked with it. I think that a lot was forgotten in the 20th century in Western culture when we got so involved with technology. And we decided that there was always a technological solution for every ailment and every ill. And if you remember, the original mental health asylums had beautiful, big, huge gardens. And as time's gone on, the garden element of healing, the outdoor space element of healing has been taken away, and people have gone for drugs and they've gone for other kinds of therapies because it seems to be efficient, and there's scientific proof with double-blind studies to show that this drug works and that drug doesn't, and nobody'd done that work on gardens because we just knew it. So why do you have to do the work? So then when the touchy-feely, hippy-dippy people like me and Patrick start talking about the good, wonderful effects of gardens, the planners and the designers, particularly the planners, say, oh, well, where's the proof? Where's the proof? We need the evidence that this works. You know, where are your figures? Where are your statistics? Because if we can't measure it, it's not there. So when I started looking at all of this, which is about 10 or 11 years ago now, there was actually very little evidence, sort of numerical, figure-based evidence about the effect of green spaces on people. People hadn't been measuring it. Now, a huge amount has changed in the last 10 years, and we are making progress. When I first started looking at it, there was, the study I could find was by a man called Roger Ulrich, who in the 1980s, he was a hospital doctor and he was involved with gallbladder surgery. And he took a large number of gallbladder surgery patients who had all had exactly the same operation, and he divided them into two groups. One group were allowed to recover in a room which had a view of a tree out of the window. The other group were allowed to recover in a room with a concrete wall to look at. And he measured the outcomes, and lo and behold, the people who'd had a tree to look at, they recovered more quickly, they took fewer painkillers, they were more cheerful, they left hospital earlier. And this was statistically significant, the sort of thing that planners will take notice of. It was definitely a good idea to let someone look at a tree while they were recovering from surgery. And having read this study, when I went for my own surgery, I made pretty sure I had a tree to look at while I was recovering, because I thought this is important. So that was a sort of an early study. And then in 2011, a guy called Porges published a book called The Polyvagal Theory. He had done some in-depth investigations into our nervous system, because it seems to me that Patrick's talked about the evolutionary theory behind our love of green spaces. But in order for this theory to be validated, we need to be able to see the physiology and the biochemistry and the actual workings of the body that have developed, because these are the things that can be inherited and passed on to the next generation and enable the evolution to occur. So if all these things are true, we should be able to see them in activities in the body. And Polyvagal theory is quite interesting on this front. It looks at our nervous system, and this is a very simplified account, but basically our nervous system operates on two levels. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, when our senses detect a potential for danger or excitement or something we've really got to get on with, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. And what happens then is our heart rate speeds up, our breathing speeds up, the blood supply is diverted to our muscles, our major muscles in our body, so we can really get on with it. As Patrick described, in stressful situations, our cognitive functions slow down. We become focused on the one thing that we have to do now, and it all gets very tense and very active and very busy, but that enables us to escape from the tiger, hunt the deer, do whatever it is that we need to do. But in order for us to be able to do that, we shut down our digestive system, our immune system, our ability to communicate with other people, and it's a very costly and energy-using process. So we need to recover, and we need to recover somewhere safe, where we don't get these stimuli which tell us that it's all very dangerous, where we get we see things that indicate that there is food, there is water, there's a place to rest, it's safe, we're not going to be attacked. That's when the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, which is organized by the vagus nerve. And that connects all sorts of interesting parts of the body. The stimulation comes from the brain. This is a lovely, safe place. And parasympathetic nervous system, it allows the heart rate to slow down. It controls the heart rate, so it can vary a little bit according to circumstances. It kicks in the digestive system, so we get hungry, we can digest our food. The immune system starts working again, so we can repair any injuries we might have, we can recover. And what I find absolutely fascinating is there's a little muscle which alters the tension in the eardrum, and it actually tunes the eardrum so we can hear human speech better. Now that means we can be there in our safe space, in our cave, and we can tune into our companions, and we can hear them, we can communicate with them, we can form relationships with them, we can plan the next hunt. This is absolutely vitally important, and it's all because of this vagus nerve and the polyvagal system. So that's a huge bit of evidence in my mind that confirms what Patrick's been saying about how the body works. Now, if we look at other functions of the body, very, very simple one, heart rate. I have a syndrome, what do they call it, white coat syndrome. I expect lots of you do. You go into a doctor's surgery, says, I'm going to take your blood pressure, and it shoots right up. Because this seems like a very, very scary thing to happen. But I've been told to take my heart rate at home, in a nice quiet environment where I'm not scared stiff. And I have discovered that if I go for a walk on Wimbledon Common in the green before I take my blood pressure, it's much, much lower than if I don't. It gets to really healthy, beautiful levels from having taken a walk on the common. And further research has shown it's not the walk that's doing it, because somebody did an experiment. They sent people out to walk in the town, and they sent some other people out to walk in a green space, and they measured the blood pressure and the heart rate. And the people who walked in the green space were in a much better state when they came back than the ones that had gone for an urban walk. So it's not the walk, it's the green. And when you've got personal evidence of it, that makes all the difference in my mind. There's an awful lot said these days about hormones. Hormones are little chemical messengers that are usually, well, very often made in the brain in response to some kind of sensory input. And they're a chemical messenger which will go to another part of the body or all through the body and affect the body to respond in particular ways. And there's one that we've probably all heard about called cortisol, the stress hormone. The stress hormone suppresses the immune system, it impairs your memory, and it stops your brain repairing. It's produced in stressful situations, and it's part of this response to shut down anything that's unnecessary in the moment. But it then tends to linger in the body, and especially if you keep on re-stressing yourself, it lingers more and more. But it has, levels of cortisol can be measured, and they have been measured. And if someone goes into a garden or for a walk on the common, and you measure their cortisol levels when they depart, and you measure their cortisol levels half an hour later, they drop. And there's lots of evidence that shows that that's the case. So getting rid of cortisol is very much a part of this recovery process that Patrick and I have been talking about. Then we have serotonin, the feel-good hormone. This hormone is produced in response to sunlight, exercise, and in the presence of healthy soil. Interesting one, that. Serotonin promotes feelings of well-being. It regulates our mood, it promotes empathy, it reduces aggression, it encourages reflection, and it makes us less impulsive, a general beneficial hormone. And in fact, we're chronically depleted of serotonin because it's produced in a part of the brain, part of the very, very ancient primitive brain, and it feeds the whole brain. But since the serotonin production area was evolved, our brain has grown 8-fold, and we don't get any more serotonin than we did when we had a brain an 1/8 of the size. So we're always using it up. So we really need to go outside into the fresh air and the sunlight to boost our serotonin levels. Yeah, the contact with the soil is interesting because it turns out there are bacteria in the soil called Mycobacteria vaccae, which actually increase serotonin production. And the way they found this out was there was some doctors treating terminal cancer patients, and they were trying to boost their immune system so that they might be able to resist the cancer a little bit more. And these bacteria in the soil are quite harmless, but they can help to trigger an immune response. So they gave this extracts of bacteria, I'm not quite sure how they did it, to these patients. And lo and behold, there was a massive reporting of increased well-being. Now, these were very, very sick people. Their cancers weren't getting any better, but they felt good about life. Further investigation showed that the bacteria were boosting serotonin production. Really very, very interesting finding, I think. So then there's exercise. Exercise has been shown to raise endorphin levels. That's the body's own opioids. And dopamine, which is the reward hormone. It's what makes you feel good when something goes well. And all exercise is good, but enjoyable exercise is even better. And it turns out that just the physical exercise of gardening is a stress buster. And it's shown to be better than going to the gym in that regard, because it's enjoyable, it's in a green space, it's doing all these other things, it's not just exercise. Yes, there's smell in the garden is terribly important. Interestingly, our smell receptors in our nose are directly connected to the olfactory centers in our brains. When we hear something or see something, the stimulus is mediated by our eyes or our ears. But with smell, it goes straight through to the brain. And that means that smell can just cut through any toxic thoughts we might be having or anything else that's going on. And we all know that you smell lavender and you're immediately back with your grandma. You smell a rose and you remember the beautiful garden that you were in. It's very, very swift and effective. And this is actually used with, it's found that people with PTSD, it's often the beginning of recovery is a scent in a garden. Sue Stuart-Smith in her book talks about a man with PTSD who is pretty much saved by the scent of eucalyptus because it cuts right through all the problems and the nonsense and to something that's deeply, deeply peaceful. I could go on, I probably shouldn't. Well,
we have got to about 11 o'clock.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things. I don't know if you have heard about forest bathing. Forest bathing is a Japanese doctor, Dr. King Lee, who's devised this therapy called forest bathing, where you walk gently, carefully, mindfully, slowly through a forest, and it's shown to boost the immune system, increase energy, increase prevalence of natural killer cells that destroy cancers, decreases anxiety, depression and anger, lifts mood, reduces rumination, reduces stress and helps sleep. So quite a few good things about forest bathing there. Turns out that it's all due to chemicals which are produced by trees as part of their defense system that are called phytoncides, and they are emitted into the air by trees, and all trees do this, but I think the Japanese Hinoki cypress is possibly a particularly good example. The experiments have shown that it's the phytoncides from the trees have these effects. And they've done this by isolating the phytoncides and forgetting about the forest, but having them in a diffuser in a room, and they have the same effect. So there's, what a connection between us and trees, that the chemicals emitted by trees make us feel good and relaxed. It's phenomenal. And it does mean that you can buy hinoki oil and put it in your diffuser and have the forest bathing effect in your room when you can't go out. So that's a useful application of it. And then there's beauty in the garden. And brain scans have been phenomenal in showing what's going on with these things, because brain scans have shown that if you see something beautiful, it activates the same areas of your brain as are activated when you're in love, which is maybe why we think our beloved is beautiful, even though maybe objectively they're not. And all these areas in the brain are associated with dopamine production, serotonin production, endorphin production. So the very act of seeing something beautiful has a physiological effect that makes us feel good. So, and what they did some surveys in a Syrian refugee camp where there was very little food, and the refugees had some gardens. And what was astonishing was that so many of them insisted on growing flowers, even when vegetables might be thought to be a better idea because they needed food. but they needed the beauty to feel better about life. And I think that's quite profound. So yeah, there's tons more evidence these days, and people are taking notice, as Patrick said. So we now have lots and lots of flower show gardens that are about well-being. People are concerned about it. Doctors are prescribing nature therapy, and gardens are a huge part of that, and terribly important. But for all the scientific evidence and the physiology and the what's going on and the proof that it's important, I think there's something else as well, which is what we're going to talk about after coffee, isn't it, Ian?
That's right, it is. Thank you. That's a very nice segue, Christina. So we're going to have a cup of coffee or a little break, whatever you want to do, for the next 25 minutes until 11:30. If you'd like to, there's a little practical exercise that you can do in terms of spending time in your gardens, or if you don't have a garden, you can't get out, just with a plant that you may have. So we've come back from our little break, and we're now going to have a conversation, Christina and Patrick, and perhaps me, as to the spirituality of the garden. We've looked at the science behind what it is to be in a green space, evolutionary science, brought it right up to date with modern understandings and work with gardens in terms of the human garden connection. But as they both said, Christina and Patrick, well, there's something deeper going on. So what is that deeper? Christina, would you kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, everything we've talked about so far has been a sort of objective view of how we understand what's going on with human beings in green spaces and gardens, a view from the outside. But what we haven't talked about yet is the view from the inside, how it makes it feel, how it makes us feel to be in such a green space or a garden, and what goes on in our psyche. There's a subject called Phenomenology, which is the exploration of the world from the point of view of the person experiencing it. So the science might tell us that the Earth is traveling around the sun and the Earth is spinning on an orbit, and looking at it all from the outside. Our human experience of that is that the sun rises in the east in the morning, travels across the sky, and sets in the evening, which is quite a different explanation of what's going on. Both are right, but they're just two different ways of looking at the thing. So what we're going to talk about now is our own personal experience of being in the garden and how we feel about it, which is what my clients were talking to me about, and is what I've experienced, what Patrick's experienced, what you all have no doubt experienced. So the physiological effects that we've been talking about are all essential, because it's all about slowing down in my experience. If you slow down enough, you can come to a state of present moment awareness, you might call it, where you're actually there mentally and psychologically in the garden. Now, with our busy lives, we don't slow down very often, and we're always thinking of the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And we might be in the garden physically, but mentally we're thinking about what's for dinner and what we're going to do tomorrow and whether the grandchildren are going to come and stay and all those other things. So to my mind, the work of the garden is to be a place that makes you slow down, even if you're not intending to do it. And if you are intending to do it, then that's even more powerful. So once you've really slowed down and you're really aware of where you are, your attention can then be drawn to the life of the garden, to the little aphid on the on the chair, or in my case last weekend to a very nice curious worm that popped out of a hole. I was scraping some cracks in the paving. I was trying to get the weeds out, and there I was, calm, meditatively doing this work, and I noticed a worm started coming out of an adjacent crack, and more worm came out of this hole, but it left its tail end in the hole, and it explored, and it went right over to where I had been working, and it nuzzled with its front end, its mouth, and sort of explored the bits of grit and soil that I dug up, and moved around and had a think about it. And then after a little while, it just quietly withdrew back into its hole. And I was with that worm. I thought, oh, you're really curious. You want to find out what I'm doing. It was quite a connection. So that kind of thing can only happen if you're slow enough to be there and to notice and participate. So you get this feeling of forgetting, well, you forget your normal cares, the normal things you're thinking about, they kind of float away. You get absorbed into the life of the garden, and there's always plenty going on. And you can get to a point where in my experience, where there's a kind of dissolution of the separation between the human and the natural world. You are no longer a separate human doing your thing to the garden. You are in the garden, part of the garden, communicating with whatever is going on in the garden. And that is a sort of meditative feeling of connection. And in my case, a profound feeling of actually belonging there. This is where I belong. And yeah, my question is this the spiritual work of the garden, this feeling of profound belonging and a kind of remembering, because we've belonged forever, but we've forgotten. And that's to me is what it's all about. So yeah, my relationship with creatures in the garden is really important to me. I have a robin, a lovely robin, in the spring, brought his mate to introduce. I felt like he was introducing his mate to me, and I was digging up the grubs, and the robin was exploring and picked up little grubs and fed them to his mate. Now she was about to lay eggs, and the more food she got, the better eggs she would lay. And I was part of that whole thing, helping the robin to feed its mate. And then I had another occasion where I was sitting in a little shelter in the garden, and it was pouring with rain, absolutely bucketing down. And this little waif blew in from the storm. It was a baby blue tit. It was tiny, and it was bedraggled, and it was wet. And I just sat there and watched, and the blue tit clearly felt that the shelter was good. And for about 20 minutes, we sat together while the blue tit dried out and flapped its wings and sort of got busy again. And then it started cheeping. I thought, this blue tit wants its mum because it needs some food. And I saw another blue tit sort of fluttering about outside, but that one could see me and was a bit anxious. So I kind of crept away and left them to it. But again, if I'd not been still and slow, that little baby blue tit wouldn't have joined me, and we couldn't have had that communication for those 20 minutes. So that kind of thing that makes me feel that I'm part of it and I belong and I'm not separate. And yeah, Ian will tell us whether that's a spiritual feeling. That's it for me. So how about you, Patrick?
Thank you, Christina. Well, there's an awful lot there I can relate to, definitely. I mean, I think it's somehow it's how, exactly as you say, Christine, it's how we interact with the garden, isn't it? You can be in a garden but actually rushing through it and not of it, can't you, sometimes, if you're not careful? And I've experienced this with in my work, my professional work with the National Trust, and some 2 or 3 years ago now, I was helping run a staff meeting at a property in North Wales, a huge castle property, and we're all indoors in this sort of rather dreary meeting room. It looks like a grand castle from the outside, but the staff rooms inside could be in a office block in Basingstoke, quite frankly. Magnolia walls and strip lights and whiteboards and laptops, all the usual modern day professional paraphernalia. We're all in there, and I was talking about nature and the outdoors with my work colleagues. And there was a bit of a moment, so a bit like we've just done now, with we all go outside with the coffee. There was a bit of a thing, and I said, "Tell you what, then, shall we just go out down to the excuse me, down to the walled garden?" It's about a 10-15 minute walk down the slope to what is actually a walled flower garden. A very special place, nice microclimate, lovely plants down there. So everyone's sort of got their mugs of coffee, put a few coats on, and walk down the steps through the castle courtyard, out across the lawns and the pleasure grounds, to all the trees, down through between the hedges, open the door into the walled garden. We all spilled into this lovely, what is a lovely south-facing terraced walled garden, not very big, but beautiful microclimate, lovely, very rare, special exotic trees and shrubs and that in there. And all the way down there, everyone's all, because it was like, you've been cooped up in the meeting and people like to just chat and say, "Oh, how are you getting on?" And you could hear this, how are our visitor figures stacking up this year against the targets, and sort of how many ice creams have you sold this year, and all that sort of businessy stuff that goes on. When you picture by the National Trust property, it looks like a swan gliding over the top, but there's all this stuff going on underneath all the time. And it's all chatter, and we all stood down, got down to the middle part of the walled garden. Everyone said, "Okay, everyone, all pay attention. Like, okay, can anyone tell me what they perhaps noticed on the way down here to the walled garden?" And it went a little bit quiet, and a few people said, "Oh, well, I don't know. There's some nice trees." So, okay, can we perhaps just stand here, just quiet, just for a couple of minutes, just stand and just quietly and just look around ourselves for 2 minutes? And so that's what we did. And then you could tell people, "Oh, there's a bird singing up, and oh, there's some butterflies there. Oh, what's that smell?" And they started asking me about the plants. Oh, oh gosh, I can smell this scent. And they started asking me as the horticulturist, "Oh, what's that scent? What scent is that plant coming from?" And you'll work outside. Do you know what sort of birds these are that are singing? And within a couple of minutes, because people had stopped and paused and were letting the garden in, they then started to notice it, and you could see people's minds just opening. Their eyes were opening. They were lighting up. So, wow, gosh, all their senses were going back to what Christine and I were both talking about in the previous session about how your senses, you're in this garden space. The cognitive features of your brain start working. Your senses start waking up. Your mind starts waking up. And that was actually happening right there, right before me, with my National Trust staff colleagues. And they could smell the fresh air. They could smell the flowering shrubs that are around us. They could hear the birds song. They could see the bees, and they were just absolutely wow, gosh. And they also, why haven't why? Someone said at the times you've come out, like quick 10-15 minutes with a mug of coffee, and go out and walk around. They'd be perhaps walking around on their phone, or the mind's still buzzing around with filling in the spreadsheet with the visitor figures for this month or whatever. And actually it's that sometimes you have got to do that bit of actually consciously stopping and allowing the garden in. And it's that little bit of a threshold that sometimes people who run garden retreats, the work of the Quiet Gardens Trust is a perfect example of these sort of ways of work. You have to sort of slightly teach people sometimes to stop and step over that threshold, which comes to the whole aspect of the design of Japanese gardens, because they have a threshold over which you step, a conscious physical thing, a little moon gate or a low gateway to stoop under or whatever, a gateway to go through. You make that transition from your life, which you leave outside, even take off your shoes, you leave take your bag off, leave it outside, step into the garden and let the garden speak to you. And it is that then your mind comes open to then the fairly sort of physical things like scent. You know, your nose opens, as Christina so wonderfully said, the scent goes bang straight through thumb of your nose into the core of your brain, and instantly you're back in granddad's garden or whatever. But then it's the sounds of the birds. You then start to notice all these connections, all the connectivity of everything. The green fly on casting the shadow, or the just now I made a quick coffee, just went and sat down towards a chair down the bottom part of my garden. I've got a fairly new sort of big herbaceous border thing I've created that's all full of Michaelmas daisies at the moment doing their thing, and on there, as was Michaelmas daisies in the sunshine this time of year, there was a red admiral butterfly and loads of honeybees all buzzing about in there. And it's the connectivity of nature you then start to notice, because your brain is in this place where its full cognitive functions are alive, they're working. I'm not stressed, I'm not running away from that lion, I'm not stood on the platform of Oxford Circus tube station, which is probably where we'll be next Thursday. You know, I'm in a safe, calm, lovely place, and my mind was open and it was calm, and it was, as my work colleagues experienced at Penryn Castle those few years ago, and I told them, but sometimes you do have to teach people this stepping over the threshold into a garden, don't you?
Yeah, you need to recognize that this can happen, and it can happen, and often does, in the wider landscape when you go for a walk. I'm particularly passionate about walking in the mountains, and it happens to me there. But I think the gardens have a particular part to play in this, because the garden is a collaboration between humans and nature, isn't it? It isn't just nature, and it isn't just humans. It's certainly a lot less humans than we tend to think. And we can craft our gardens to an extent so that they are a sanctuary. And the way we think about them as a sanctuary and a safe place, and even a sacred place, a special place. I have visitors who come to my garden who say they think of my garden as their special place. So they know when they're coming, there's an intention to be in a special place where they know that they're going to have these experiences. So the garden is this wonderful collaboration and sort of manipulation to make it into the place where these things can happen. And interesting from a garden designer's point of view, what's interesting, a garden is an intermediary between the human space of indoors and the wild space of out there in the countryside. And when you're designing a garden, you make the artifacts that you put in the garden, they are always larger than the things in the house. Garden chairs, for instance, are always bigger than dining room chairs, but they're still smaller than the wild landscape. So you're kind of easing people from their human existence through this garden, which is a bit of an expansion of that, but not as scary as the wilderness. And gardens are terribly important, particularly for people who are a little bit anxious or frightened, because they're safe and yet they are nature as well. And that's what I think is important. So that's kind of what happens, and that's, I suppose, the quiet fascination is becoming absorbed in the life of the garden and recognizing that you belong there, and it's all going on, whatever's happening in your own life. I mean, I thought about it so often with COVID last year in lockdown. I go out into the garden, and the birds and the bees didn't give a stuff about COVID. They were just getting on with their lives, and that felt very comforting and rather special. So yeah, so I don't know if we want to think a bit about how you can enhance that experience.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, Christine, exactly that. And say, I mean, in my own garden here, I mean, I have had to sort of pull myself. I'm sort of very fortunate in some ways. So it's a lot of work. I've got about an acre of garden here, another acre orchard. And so there's a lot for me to look after. I was finding myself tearing around my garden like a bull in a china shop, and there'd be one flower border, fairly narrow flower border. In terms to get from one part of the garden to the next, I'd just step and career right through the middle of this border to get to where the sort of my nice wildflower lawns were the other side. And I'd be tearing through all the garden. I thought, hang on a minute. Practice what you preach here, Patrick Swan. Slow down, calm down. And just literally by not tearing through the middle of that border, by walking to the end of the pergola, turning right down the side of the box hedge, turn right through the opening in the box hedge, so I enter my wildflower lawns in that Japanese garden way of entering your garden in a respectful way, in a calm way. You then enter that piece of garden with your mind in the right place. So already just by how I walk around my own garden, I change my relationship with the garden, then consequently how the garden then speaks to me, simply by changing how I walk, physically move myself around from one part of the garden to the next.
Yeah.
And from that, you then start, as Christina says, you start to build this relationship with the garden. So I started with, my garden is more than just an semblance of lovely trees and shrubs and plants, my stamp collection of lovely rare shrubs, that I've got this more than that. It's certainly a lot more than a rod to beat me, keep nagging at me saying, come on, weed this, prune that, do that. But it is seriously and genuinely a constant, and the comfort probably sounds almost a weak and trite word at this point, but it is something with which I'm connected, that, as Christina says, it is always there. Just now when I was sat down the bottom in this sort of herbaceous bordery bit, the bees are whizzing around and the butterflies are whizzing around and there were little insects on the floor and the sun was coming down. It's glorious and sunny here in Worcestershire this morning. And it was just a layer after layer of connectivity throughout the garden, of nature, of sunshine, of plant life, of animal life, of insect life, and then me, human life, as connected. I could be as connected with that as those bees and butterflies on that Michaelmas daisy as they were, if I would stop and allow myself to be so. And it's stopping yourself, isn't it, and allowing yourself to be as connected as that bee on that Michaelmas daisy.
Yeah, it's all about your attitude to your garden. Now, I was grown up in a command and control kind of a household, and my mother's attitude to gardening was to keep it under control, keep everything pruned and clipped and weeded, and there was a plant and there was a weed, and the weed was bad and the plant was good, and that's how it was. And what I've learned in my own garden is actually there is no such thing as total human control of the garden. It's just not worth even trying. And over the years, I've changed my whole attitude to gardening. So I feel as if I'm introducing a new plant, it's a suggestion, it's an introduction. It may not like it, and it may not like where it is, and if it doesn't like where it is, chances are it will move somewhere else all by itself. I've got rudbeckias that have migrated across the garden just because they prefer it somewhere else. And I've learned to allow a lot of happenstance. I've learned not to distinguish between weeds and plants, but to allow things to grow and see if we like each other. And so gardening's become a matter of editing, not weeding. You allow things to grow, and then something happens. And if it really is not working, then I pull it out. But very often, nature makes wonderful combinations that I would never have dreamt of. And it's beautiful, and it's slightly wild, it's slightly on the edge of chaos, but it has a wonderful effect on the human psyche to be there and see what nature is doing. So I think I tend to think more of collaboration and less of, well, hopefully not. Well, every so often the control thing comes out again, and I go and clear something pretty thoroughly. But yeah, it's.
Tell us about this conversation you had with Denise Inge, who was the very lovely wife of Bishop, who sadly died a few years ago. But we knew her a little bit here at Holland House, and I know you met with her, and you had a conversation around something that you spoke to me about, the perfection of imperfection. So
Yeah,
I really like that.
yeah. This is this sort of it comes from or partly from a Japanese idea of the word's gone out of my head now. Do you know, Patrick? I'm trying to say wasabi, which is
wabi sabi. Is it something like that? Yes.
completely gone. Wabi sabi. Anyway, it's this idea that if something is utterly pristine and perfect, and you look at it, all you will do is look for any flaw or imperfection. But if something is already a bit rough and ready and imperfect, but say it's a teacup and it just fits in your hand, then that's actually perfect. It's to do with things that are ancient, that have acquired a patina, which is something a bit beyond human control, but adds to the character of the whole thing. So that's one sort of aspect of perfection, of imperfection. And the Japanese, there's another thing about symmetry in gardens. With our Renaissance gardens, everything had to be perfectly immaculate and symmetrical, and box hedge on one side would match the box hedge on the other side. And actually, it's very true. If you go to such a garden, if there's something slightly out of whack, you immediately notice that, and you forget about the supposed calming effect of the garden. But I talked about it in a slightly different context with Denise Inge. She was one of the quiet garden hosts, and we had a wonderful chat. And we talked about how relaxing it is for visitors when they come to your garden and they see a few weeds, and they see a few things that are dying, and a few things that are out of place, and the sort of things that you might feel embarrassed about as the gardener, because actually it makes people feel very comfortable, because they can think about their own garden and think, oh yeah, well, this person is showing her garden to the public and it's not completely perfect, so that feels fine. And of course, no garden is ever perfect in that kind of technical way. There's always something going on that you haven't planned for or doesn't quite work out. So
yeah, that's wabi sabi. W-A-B-I.
That's it. Wabi sabi.
W-A-B-I hyphen S-A-B-I. Wabi sabi. It's Japanese, as you rightly say.
Yeah. I get confused because I always try and say wasabi, which is the green sauce you have with sushi.
Yeah. That's not what it is. So yeah, and it's appreciating beauty that is imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete.
That's
which is exactly straight out of the Zen Buddhist tradition, actually.
Yeah, and it applies to gardens, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I have to. This is where I have to again teach myself, as the horticulture, as the head gardener of Arley Hall in Cheshire and consultant for all the head gardeners in the National Trust in Wales. So you can imagine having a garden shipshape in Bristol fashion. For me, it's what I do for a profession, is what I'm a professional in. But it is actually realizing, and I can do that slightly more on my own garden scale here, is actually when you have that connection, that relationship with your garden, and your garden actually it's your friend, your comfort, your constant, come what may. And we all have things going on in our lives and events and life events and things. I've got things going on in my life. I've got a health thing, will now be a permanent health thing going on, all sorts of stuff. But the garden, as Christina said, all through COVID last year, everything, the garden is always there. Those bees and butterflies are out of my Michaelmas daisies at the moment. They don't care. They're happy. They're in, and yeah, and people can say, oh, well, that's all very trite, but actually no, because you realise that what is actually important here, is it the fact that I'm down at the bottom of my garden, connected with it, and bringing down the, you know, calming the mind down, getting the serotonin going, the dopamine, all those other things that Christina so eloquently talked about earlier, or is it, or, you know, and it's that, rather than me start to look at, oh gosh, this all needs deadhead and that needs weeding. Gosh, look at that hedge at the bottom of the garden needs cutting, which it does. I've got a big long hedge between the garden and the orchard. I haven't cut it once yet this year. It's a mess. But actually, you know what? It will get done at some point. It's a lovely natural, actually field boundary hedge. It's a beautiful thing. It'll be full of sloe berries in there, so I can make some sloe gin later on. And actually, it's all very lovely. And so you start to realise actually the garden isn't a taskmaster. It's actually a companion who, and a friend. So in the same way as you would care for a loved one, accept a loved one for who they are, not what you would want them to be, but who they are now today, you then come to learn and love and live with your garden as it is today. So yes, you may yearn for an acre of country garden, but if you wish for that, just remember what it takes to look after it. But actually, any connection with any green thing, a lovely pot plant on the shelf, a potted orchid, it is that connection, and you can have that connection with any living green thing that then becomes your constant, your if you like, your spiritual companion, that then opens your mind up, gets your mind in such a state it can then be open to a greater spiritual awareness. So this is where this all eventually ends up. Yes, it's great for our body physiologically and mentally, and our, you know, our heart rate calms down, our senses open up, and we're in there and we feel this connectivity with nature, which we have this sort of historical evidence that we are connected with it. But once our minds are in that position, fantastic. But actually then beyond that, if we want to then dig deeper into the spirituality of ourselves, into a faith or a belief or that side of things, our minds and our bodies are then at that point in a position to enable us to do that, which we wouldn't be if we were tearing around with our minds all over the place in an urban environment.
I think we sort of touched on the feelings about chores in the garden. And I'm always reminded of Thich Nhat Hanh, the wonderful Buddhist monks. I don't know if any of you have seen his meditation on doing the washing up. Do you know that one, Ian?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the meditation is all about doing the dishes, and how if while you're doing the dishes, your mind is elsewhere and you're thinking about the cup of tea you're going to have after you've done the dishes, and you're totally focused on the cup of tea and you just do the dishes mechanically. A, doing the dishes becomes a terrible, boring chore. And B, you're not there. You're thinking about the cup of tea. And then when you finish the dishes, you go and have the cup of tea and you're not there either, because you're thinking of the fact that you've got to go and post a letter or something, or do something else afterwards. And you can live your whole life like that, just always not being quite there in the moment and always thinking about what you're going to do next. And it's the same with the garden. You look out in the garden and you feel there's a chore that needs to be done, like sweeping or scraping cracks in the paving or doing the weeding or something. And you can see it as a chore if you think, oh my God, I've got to get this done. The visitors are coming. I'll be judged if it's not looking perfect. They'll think I'm failing. And all these thoughts can come up, and we're all very prone to have those thoughts, particularly if we're proud of our gardens. And it's a sort of a practice to try and dismiss those thoughts and see it as something that you're doing in the moment. Your garden is calling to you. There is something to be done. You focus entirely on the thing that you're doing. You don't think, oh, I'm doing the cracks in the paving, and then I'll do the sweeping, and then I'll do the weeding, and then I'll cut the hedge, and then I'll do, and I'll be exhausted by 6 o'clock this afternoon. You just focus on the cracks in the paving, the worm that's coming out of the hole, the robin that's introducing you to its mate, whatever is going on. And that way, the garden gets done. You're in communication with it, you're connected to it. And actually, if there's a corner at the back where you haven't done the weeding, the visitors are never going to notice anyway. So,
I mean, that's a great spiritual practice, actually. And the practice being doing by not doing.
well, you actually are doing.
That's called, well, you are, but you're not, but it's not, but it's effortless in the sense that you're not slaving away at it. You're doing it because you're doing it. There's the work, you just do it. It's called Wu Wei in Chinese. I think it's WU-WEI or something like that. It's in the Tao Te Ching. It's by Lao Tzu, Chinese philosophy. It's exquisite. There's lots of translations of it, so you need to find the right one if you ever want to buy it. But that's at the heart of the Tao, is that there is this effortless being, this effortless work where you're not striving, you're not, churning through it, you're not grinding it out. And that happens when you just are doing what you got to do. That's the Zen, in the Zen tradition, they say, do what you're doing, which is exactly what you're
kind of taking part in an unfolding, aren't you? Rather than making it happen.
Yeah.
You're aligning yourself with the unfolding.
So have you experienced Wu Wei, Patrick?
Yes, well, really, just those very words that Christine just said, taking part in an unfolding rather than steering it yourself, realizing that you are just a part of being out there with the birds and bees and butterflies and weeds and everything else. And this sort of what I call mindful gardening, the ultimate expression of which is the Zen gardener in Japan raking the gravel. And those gardens do take a little bit of understanding, but I can see what they're about. But it is so when I'm down the bottom of my garden and I'm surrounded by an acre that's nipping at my heels, saying do this, do that, actually it is shutting out each little bit, chip away. You are caring for this thing that cares for you, so you are giving back to something that I'm giving back to something that gives to me, exactly as you would care for a loved one if they're ill or if they need a bit of care, or just go and making your partner a cup of tea or whatever. It's exactly that. And in life, your partner will need more than just that cup of tea to sustain them for the rest of their life. But that is a little gift, a little thing you are doing for your partner, to take them a cup of tea. I'm doing a cup of tea, putting the kettle. Oh, would you like one as well? Rather than selfishly just going off and doing your own cup of tea, you are thinking of your partner. My partner gives to me, so I will give to them just a cup of tea, and that will not solve their whole life, the rest of their life, but it is just that little bit of a step. And in the same way, me pulling out a few little weeds, a little bit of a square part of my garden, it gives back to this thing that in just such abundance gives to me and is constantly there. And it's this thing that the garden is always there and is constantly there, as I think a lot of us have found out through all of the tribulations of the last year. And whatever goes on, that garden will always patiently be out there waiting for me to step out into it, and it will always be ready for me and accepting of me and welcoming of me, and will give to me in an abundance.
And yet there are things we can do to make that work better. Here's the garden designer coming back. We can make alterations to our gardens. We can introduce features that will help all this process to happen, that will help the slowing down, that will enable us to connect more easily. And this is where it becomes interesting to think about your own garden and maybe how you can tweak things a bit so that it all becomes easier. The Japanese talk a lot about the journey through the garden, and I think that's something to think about. In Japanese gardens, sometimes it's a garden to be looked at from the veranda of the Buddhist monastery behind you, and you look out over the garden, which is stones and water and highly clipped plants, and they will have created a journey, a route around the garden that you can't walk on. It's only a garden to be looked at, but there is nonetheless a journey within that garden that takes the eye around the garden. So the journey is important, and there are things that you can do in your own garden to make it into a journey. And obviously, if you're designing a garden from scratch, you will try and do that. But one of the interesting things about the journey is paths. So I'm just going to take one example. Paths are so important in gardens because you can have a path that goes from the kitchen door to the dustbins, and you want it to be straight and even and easy, and you get to the dustbins quickly and you get back inside before you get too wet when it's raining. It's a very utilitarian thing. But if you're designing a garden with a journey in it, the way you design your path around the garden becomes quite important. And in Japanese tea gardens, they're particularly good at path. And the thing is, if you think about the journey around the garden, it's quite important to maybe not have a view of the whole of the garden, just have a part of the garden. And that chimes in with some research that some people did about landscapes that people prefer to be in. Human beings like to be in open savanna type landscapes, so there's something behind them so they don't get pounced on. But they don't just like an open field. They like little clumps of trees. So there's space, but there's interest. There's things to look around. So if in your garden there's something to walk around and find out what's going on behind it, that will make it a much more absorbing kind of experience. And if the path is a little bit rough and uneven, then you will look down and you'll get absorbed into whatever's growing by the side of the path, grasses, plant, wildflowers, ferns, whatever it may be. There's actually even a garden at Chelsea that did that this year. I remember Adam Frost on Gardener's World pointing it out. And then the Japanese do that very, very cleverly, and their paths in tea gardens are very rough and very uneven, and you need to concentrate quite carefully so as not to trip on them, which might be tricky in your National Trust gardens, Patrick, because this health and safety will kick in there. But then you go a certain distance along the path looking at the ground, and then it's designed so that you step onto a big slab of stone, which is probably the base of a temple pillar or something, and you step onto this big slab of stone, and whew, I've arrived, I'm safe, I've negotiated the path. I look up, and then you see what's been cleverly placed for you to look at, be it a flowering cherry tree, a maple, a beautiful lantern, whatever it is. And then you really see that because it's suddenly brought to your attention, and then you continue the path so that the whole journey, although it may only be a few yards, becomes a complete adventure and totally absorbing, because you're having to negotiate with it, you're having to make your way. So there are quite a lot of things you can do in your own garden you don't have to import Japanese maple trees and Zen philosophy or anything. You just have to think a little bit about how does the journey around your garden work? And then when the journey has happened and you arrive somewhere, what's that place like? Is it a place where you feel inclined to sit down? Has it got something protecting you behind? Maybe something in front of you to look at, a little pool of water or a beautiful plant or a piece of sculpture, something that moves. Water is perfect because you can have a little fountain or just the ripples on the water, and then there will be plants growing and things quite close to you that will catch your attention because you've slowed down so much. You've sat down, it's comfortable, it feels safe, it's green, there's a little bit of movement from plants or from water, and there will be wildlife because there always is. And if you're close enough to it and you've slowed down enough, it'll catch your attention. It may be a spider building a web, or it may be water dripping off a tree. Could be the fish in the pond. It could be a bird singing in a tree, whatever it is. But I think the point I'm making is the way you manipulate the design of the garden can help or hinder that experience. It's all straight paths to destinations and everything's completely sort of laid out and obvious. Why bother go outside? You can see it all from indoors.
Yeah, and it's this understanding again. It's this as a Japanese approach to this. It's realizing that this is a journey through the garden. It's a layering of experiences, one upon the next, upon the next, upon the next. The best way of describing it is perhaps imagine, say, you're at the theatre, at a theatrical production, and you see that production from the moment the curtain goes up through Act 1, 2, 3, 4, however long it is, to the finale at the end when the curtain goes down, and you are going, and so it all the story you are having it unfolded in front of you on the stage makes sense as the program as you were looking through. Imagine you came into it half an hour after the interval and you whiz straight into it. You could sort of pick up, well, what's going on here? But you are not experiencing that scene with having had the experiences of the first part of the program. And in the same way, a journey around the garden, the Japanese realize that everything you see, and this comes out actually in a lot of their art, all a lot of manifestations of Japanese art, is that everything you see, it is based upon the experience that you have had just before. So it was layer upon layer. So you've turned this corner in the garden, you are seeing that from the mindset of where you've just come from, and you reverse back, you saw that through the mindset of what you've just come from there. So as Christina said, it's building this layer upon layer of experience as you are journeying around the garden. So this moment of little bit of danger, little bit of trepidation, I've got to just careful how I walk on this slightly wobbly, mossy coloured stone in the tea garden, and you turn the corner and then you have the resting. So it's this building up of emotion and then calming you down again and building up, and then you get a lovely view, and then you have that bit of rest, and then you might go through another slightly more challenging part of the garden, and eventually then you come to the resting place. And it's a journey of the mind, of experiences, of emotions that works with your mind, plays with your mind to a certain extent, in layers, built up layer, one top of the other, until you come to that final resting point, your favorite chair, whatever, in your garden.
And I think we're giving the impression that everybody's got to have an enormous garden for this massive exploration to happen. And I mean, the Japanese show us that you can do it virtually, as it were, by having a layout where the eye follows lines rather than the feet having to follow the lines. And if you've got a tiny little garden, there are all sorts of tricks you can bring in. Particularly if it's a tiny garden in the city where the views out of the garden are perhaps not particularly desirable. There might be a great block of flats at the bottom of your garden, or the neighbour's swings on the other side. There are ways in which you can bring the focus of your attention within the garden, so that the whole aim of the garden is to encircle you and be a circle. And the main interest in the garden, be it water or fountain or whatever it is right in the centre. And all the lines of the garden are concentric, because every time your eye catches a line, it will follow it, and it brings you right round to the beginning again. What you don't want is too much verticality of lines going upwards, because then your eye, if you've got a single birch tree, for instance, your eye will follow up the line of the trunk, and then you're kind of lost. You've lost your anchor. You're out of the garden. You're somewhere else. So there's lots of design tricks that can help to create this feeling of safety and enclosure and fascination within your garden, however tiny it is. And that's what we did at Malvern, isn't it, Patrick?
Yes.
It's a garden of concentric circles, and that's essentially what enables someone to be in the garden and be largely unaware of what's going on outside the garden. Because
because the centerpiece of that garden was a labyrinth, wasn't it? But people followed a narrow little labyrinth around, and surround, your mind is on following the path, and you were surrounded, cocooned. The garden was circular in shape, cocooned by this lovely planting, slightly naturalistic, not rigid planting, but slightly naturalistic sort of planting. Oh, here we go. Ian's got the thing in there, so you can see on the picture on the left there the stone tiles. So imagine you follow your feet on that narrow stone tile.
Or your eyes.
Your eyes. Yeah, and you could say you could even just stand there and do it with your eyes, and that follows round to that bench with the arched windows at the back. You've got the focal point of that lovely water feature and pond in the middle there, and so the garden is all encompassing, all absorbing, and your mind just draws you in, almost like a magnet. Imagine a magnet drawing you into that, and drawing your mind in and calming it all down. And all the science that we've spoken to at the head of this gathering this morning, it all starts to happen, and by working the design of your garden, you can make that happen. Actually, I mean, that was actually a fairly compact space there. As Christina says, some of these Japanese gardens, I mean, some of them, you can have a tiny, I mean, Japanese houses are tiny, and they can have a little courtyard garden in the middle, which literally you just view out from a window, and it can nearly be literally sort of 6 feet by 8 feet, with a tree and a stone and some gravel and this sort of thing, literally like the size of a small single bedroom, and that is your garden. But it is designed in such a way to take your eye around on a virtual journey to bring your mind to a restful place.
I mean, I particularly love these windows that you created, because in a sense, I mean, they're on one hand they're not, well, windows in a sense that there's a pane of glass and that it's just basically you've just framed, I think really cleverly, some space so that your eye goes through them to what lies beyond in a very easy, natural sort of way. That I think those 3 windows.
Yeah, it was interesting, the illusions in the garden, because while I was standing around and talking to visitors during the course of the week, I had people telling me, well, it was clearly a Christian garden because of the church windows. And then somebody said, well, actually, it's a Catholic Christian garden because of the colours of the the priest's robes at certain times of the year. And then somebody said, well, actually, do you know what? It's a Buddhist garden, because I've been to a Buddhist garden and it reminds me of it. And then somebody else said it's a Quaker garden, which happened to be sort of true because it was largely built by Quakers, as it happened. And then somebody else said it was an Islamic garden because the shape of the garden was the same as a key is Islamic shape. And then other people just said, oh, what a lovely place. And what was interesting was that people saw what they needed to see and connected with it in that way.
Yeah, and as Christina said earlier on, everyone seemed to gravitate in front of it. There was all these lovely high-tech, wonderful show gardens around us, and usual with these sort of stainless steel industrial water features and all these sort of things. But people just wanted to be next to this garden, and interestingly, on the local news and everything, they wanted, they were doing the report from the Malvern Showground, the RHS show. Which garden did they stand in? Which was the most photogenic? Which is the one that the news reporter wanted to stand in front of? Lo and behold, it was this quiet garden. We called it our sort of quiet garden, this oasis of peace and calm within an exciting but busy showground space. And this is actually the place where everyone wanted to congregate and wanted to come to.
Why did you use the labyrinth as a pathway rather than some other kind of shape?
We wanted something of interest. I was busy discovering labyrinths at the time, so I suppose it was a natural thing. And I was talking to a lovely lady, Felicity, who designs labyrinths for all sorts of people. And we thought the idea of a labyrinth, because a labyrinth, you get the little theme running through it was you get lost in a maze, but in a labyrinth you find your way, because the labyrinth shows you the way to the center and then shows you the way out again. So you make a journey and you come to the center where you can rest, and then you come out again. So it's a peaceful thought. An interesting thing was we couldn't fit a whole labyrinth, common kind of labyrinth in, because the pond was in the way in the middle, and we wanted the pond as well. So we designed this. You can't really see it in the pictures, but the labyrinth, you can go in one side and it takes you to a flat stone in front of the bench. And then there's another bit of the labyrinth going out the other way. And somebody told me that unbeknownst to us, we had designed a reconciliation labyrinth. So the two parties that need to be reconciled would both enter on their separate paths, the two paths going in. They would make their own journeys. They would meet at the stone at the back, where they would be able to have a conversation. Having calmed down, having slowed down, they would sit on the seat and look at the water feature and have a sensible conversation about whatever it is they disagree about, come to an agreement, and then they might go out their separate ways, or they might go out on the same route together.
That's fun. I've never heard of a reconciliation labyrinth, but that is what a beautiful idea, and something that's tangible and that we can actually, build and practice. That's a wonderful thing.
I can't remember who told me. I might have a record of it somewhere, but it was. I thought it was very powerful. Yeah. I was rather bemused to think that we'd kind of done that without knowing what we were doing, but we've done it.
Yes, you did.
So that was good.
I'm going to stop the screen share now. So we've got 12:30, and so I first of all, thank Christina and Patrick very much for their inputs this morning. I think they've very beautifully articulated a massive area. And in a very short time. But we've looked at the science behind these things. We've looked at, touched on the spirituality of the garden as well. And so I want to thank them both very much for that. And at this point, I'm just going to stop the recording now. And then we'll have a little talk about what we're going to do for lunch and afterwards. But thank you both very much indeed for your input. It's completely fascinating and really uplifting, actually. So thank you both very much.